Hey everyone, I'm Belle Reid and welcome back to another video. So recently, Zlob Modular sent me this new module to check out, the F3DB. This module is a fixed filter bank with envelope followers, a bunch of clipping circuits, and a couple of different built-in feedback paths. So generally speaking, feedback and envelope followers are two of my favorite things. So I was pretty excited to explore this and see what it's all about. Hi. Hello. In this video, I'm going to talk about what fixed filter banks are and how they work. And we're also going to take a look at a few different patch examples using the F3DB to create some classic fixed filter bank style patches, some crazy chaotic feedback-based patches. And I'm also going to take a look at using the F3DB to perform a kind of spectral analysis on an external sound source in order to generate control voltage for a patch. Okay, so first things first, what is a fixed filter bank? In a nutshell, a fixed filter bank is a collection of filters that are all tuned to different fixed frequencies. Typically, they have a low-pass filter on the lowest band, a high-pass filter on the highest band, and any number of bandpass filters in between. Depending on their design, different fixed filter banks are going to feature a different number of bands. And the tuning of these bands is going to vary based on the desires of the designer. Fixed filter banks were a common part of early tape music studios, and because of that have also been part of modular synthesizers since their inception. Early examples include the Moog 907 and 914, which are 10 and 14 band filter banks, respectively. Buchla's 100 series instruments also included two models of fixed filter banks, the 194 and the 195. These were different in design from Moog's fixed filter banks in that they had individual outputs for each band, but they did not have a summed output or level controls for the individual bands. So if you wanted to mix all of the bands together, you had to use a separate mixer module. That design changed with the Buchla 200 series. We have the 294 and the 295, which incorporated both direct signal outputs for each band, as well as a mixed output with level controls for each band. And they led to the development of Buchla's 296 programmable Spectral processor. I'll discuss this module in a little more detail later on in this video. So at this point, you might be wondering to yourself why you would want to use a filter where the frequencies can't even be changed. The most iconic sound of a filter has to do with sweeping the cutoff frequency so that we can hear the darkening or the brightening of a sound. Single filters like low pass or high pass, band pass with variable cutoff frequencies are certainly a lot more common in synthesizers than fixed filter banks. And they also play a pretty different role when it comes to sound manipulation. Fixed filter banks provide you with a way of accessing a very different timbral color and individually accentuating different regions of overtones within a sound. This can lend itself to some super interesting results. For example, here on this module, we have 6 bands. So I have some noise patched into the input here of the F3DB, and I'm just going to start to turn up each filter band one at a time so we can take a listen to it. something that's really interesting about a fixed filter bank is that you can isolate different frequency bands that are not necessarily right next to each other. All right, so I've swapped the noise source out for a saw wave now, and I'm going to do a similar thing here, bringing in one band at a time so that we can take a listen. So far, I've been using this sum output, which is a sum of all 6 of the bands, but we also have odd and even outputs here as well. So I'm going to patch the odd output, which is going to be bands 1, 3, and 5 into one channel of my mixer, and the even output, which is going to be bands 2, 4, and 6 into another. So using the odd and even outputs like this means that you are able to process the odd and even bands separately if you wanted to, right? It also means that we can take a mono sound source like this one, and by panning the odd bands to the left and the even bands to the right, we are able to spread this mono sound out across the stereo field. All right, so there's a lot going on inside this module beyond these 6 filter bands. So let's take a quick look over the entire thing and get a feel for the signal flow through this module. So I'm just going to do a quick rundown of this module, and we're going to come back to each of these features in more depth later on in this video with accompanying patch demos for each main feature. In the bottom left corner here, there are 2 inputs for this module, and these inputs are then passed into this clipping feedback circuit. You have the option of turning on hard or soft clipping here using these switches, and you can dial up the amount of feedback in this initial clipping circuit by turning this knob up here and turning this switch labeled GFB for gain feedback on here as well. From there, the sound is passed into the fixed filter bank. And as we know, we have these 6 filter bands. Each one can be muted using these switches up top, and you can turn clipping on for each individual filter band as well using these switches. There is a VCA for each of these filter bands here, and control voltage inputs, again, for each of the 6 filter bands. They then pass into dedicated envelope followers for each of the 6 bands, and we also have dedicated outputs for each of the individual bands as well. In addition to the dedicated outputs, we also have a sum output, which is the sum of all 6 of the bands, and then we have an odd output and an even output. This summed signal is then sent back in to the module's input, and we have an additional feedback path here where we can dial up the amount of feedback that is sent back into the input by turning up this feedback knob here. And there's a modulation input and an external feedback input jack as well. You have the option with this module of introducing hard and soft clipping at the input and also clipping at each individual filter band. So I'm going to turn this up here. I have a low sequence on the DPO running into the F3DB. And I am going to play around with turning on and off clipping at these various stages to see what kind of distortion we can get. For the most part, when we think about classic fixed filter banks, like the Moog modules that I mentioned earlier, those were modules that did not have any voltage control capability over the levels of the frequency bands inside the filters. So you could manually tune and set the levels of each of the bands inside the filter bank, but you weren't able to directly modulate them. Now, there were some workarounds to this, of course. The early Buchla fixed filter banks, for example, had individual outputs on each of the filter bands. So you could patch those outputs into individual VCAs, and then you could modulate the levels of the VCAs in order to achieve this effect. I also recently discovered that Wendy Carlos had Moog modify her modular system. On Carlos's Moog system, she had two fixed filter banks that were both modified to have these individual outputs for each frequency band. And she would run those into individual envelope followers, and then one set would go into the input of a series of individual VCAs, and the other set would go into the control voltage inputs of those same VCAs. This setup is part of the fundamental basis of how a vocoder works, which is pretty cool. The F3DB does have control voltage inputs on the 6 frequency bands, so it's pretty easy for us to run some modulation sources in there and create more dynamic patches. So in this patch, I'm running just a simple saw wave output from the DPO into the F3DB input. And then I'm using a number of different cycling envelopes from these two functions here, from the envelope output on Strega and from the dynamic envelope output on the zero control. And I'm using each of these envelopes to modulate the levels of these 4 middle bands here. They're all running at slightly different rates from one another and have different attack and decay lengths, which is causing all of the different bands to cycle independently from one another. We can, of course, also manually add in these high and low bands as well. Play around with turning up the feedback. Something else that's nice is to patch an external input, so I'm just going to take the output of the Strega here and run that into the feedback in, which is going to defeat the normalization from the sum out into the feedback in. And this will act as a VCA here, so we can turn this up and we'll be able to hear this external input. A super fun trick that many people have discovered over the decades is that running feedback through a fixed filter bank sounds really interesting. A great example of this is found in the Surge resonant EQ. In the 1970s onward, it became common for people to modify this module to include a feedback control knob to introduce the module's output back into its own input, causing the filters to self-oscillate in often very unpredictable ways. My personal introduction to working with feedback in this way was through no-input mixing, in which you take the outputs of an analog mixer and you run them back into the mixer's inputs, causing it to self-oscillate. You can tune the tones that emerge from feedback patches like this by adjusting the gain knobs and the EQ settings on the mixer. But the results are always inherently chaotic and unpredictable, which is part of the reason why I love this technique so much. Something that's really interesting about working with feedback patches like this is that the controls that you manipulate manually can have a really wide range of unexpected results. For example, you can cut the high frequencies in a sound using an EQ. And instead of the result being a reduction of high frequencies, which is what you would expect it to be, it could instead send your patch into strange new sputtery patterns, or it could cause an entirely new sound to emerge. If you're interested in learning more about no-input mixing in particular, I'll leave a link to a video I made a little while ago that walks you through that practice in detail. So this module is set up perfectly to explore this idea of no-input mixing because it has these two different feedback loops that are built right into the module. Okay, so I'm going to play around and explore some feedback patches here for a few minutes, and I'm just going to adjust different configurations of things like the clipping settings on each different band, the hard soft clipping, whether or not this gain feedback is turned on, of course the gain and feedback amounts themselves, and we will see what we discover. Cool. So it's clearly possible to use this module when working with feedback to create a lot of really chaotic and crazy and noisy sounds, which are awesome. It's also possible however, to use this without any input, just working with feedback to create patches that are really beautiful and really rhythmic. So here again, I have nothing patched into the input, and I am just using a clock from the Wogglebug to modulate the feedback amount. And I'm also running the output here of the F3DB into Strega in order to add a little bit of delay onto the sound. So I have these top 4 bands turned off right now, so I'm going to switch them on one at a time. No input mixing is a super, super fun technique, but something that I always find myself kind of wishing that I had access to when I'm working with a standard mixer for this is the ability to modulate different parameters and to automate different aspects of the patch. So something that's really fun about this, of course, is that we do have control voltage inputs on each one of these frequency bands. So in this patch, I'm using the gate outputs from the zero control to modulate the individual bands in the filter bank. And I'm also doing a little bit of modulation of the feedback amount also from the zero control. And I'm sending a random voltage in to modulate the direction that the sequence is going on the zero control, just to create a little bit more variety there as well. All right, so I'm just going to turn these channels up here one at a time. Yeah, so this is pretty cool because now we have the ability to create a sequenceable no input mixer. And then we can kind of interrupt the sequence and play around with it, which is also fun. This module also has a dedicated envelope follower on each of the 6 frequency bands. So this means that we can derive 6 different modulation sources based on the loudness or intensity of an incoming sound at each of these different frequency bands. So in this patch, I'm using the envelope follower outputs from 3 different bands on the fixed filter bank to turn up the levels on 3 different audio sources. I'm running the DPO into the first channel of the Optimix here, and I'm using the envelope follower output on this lowest of these 3 bands to turn the level up on that. Then I am taking the audio output from the Wogglebug into the second channel of the Optimix, and I'm doing the same thing here, but with this middle of these 3 frequency bands. And then I'm running this upper frequency band here into the blend modulation input on Strega, and I have the delay time knob turned all the way to the left. So on the Strega, that is going to create this really noisy, chaotic, kind of bubbly, percolating sound. So essentially, if I'm able to control the amount or the range of frequency content in my voice, I should be able to turn up and down these 3 different sounds. All right, so now that we've tested these basic ideas out, let's take a look at a slightly more complex implementation of this idea. Before we jump into the patch demo itself, I promised that I would talk a little bit more about the Buchla 296 module. The 296 was one of Buchla's most functionally dense filter bank modules. This module also had envelope followers for each band, so it can be used as a kind of spectral decoder for an external input. One artist who has been particularly influential to me and has used this technique a lot in his work is David Rosenboom. An interesting example of this can be heard on this record, Rosenboom and Buchla collaboration in performance, on the piece And Out Come the Night Ears from 1978. In this piece, Rosenboom plays the piano into a Buchla 296, and he sends the various bands' envelope follower outputs to modulate a number of different parameters within his Buchla system. The result of this is that activity taking place in different registers on the piano trigger different sonic behaviors on the synthesizer. David Rosenboom and I also recently performed a duo version of his piece titled Choose Your Universe, in which he explored this idea using a Eurorack system and electric violin. So for this next patch, I'm essentially translating these ideas over to the F3DB module. So this patch looks a little bit more complex, but in a nutshell, what I'm doing is I'm taking the envelope follower outputs from each of the frequency bands on the F3DB, and I'm using them to modulate and interact with various parameters of the patch. For example, the speed of the zero control sequencer, the delay modulation. I'm using one of these middle bands here, running it into function and using it to trigger a whole bunch of random voltages, which are then being sent out to various places, like controlling the direction on the sequence, the pitch that we hear volt per octave on the Strega, FM on the DPO, and so on. All right, so let's take a listen to this patch. All right, so we've taken a look at how to use the F3DB module in a number of different ways. As a classic fixed filter bank, as a chaotic feedback hub, and we've also taken a look at how to use it to perform spectral analysis or spectral decoding to generate dynamic control voltages from an external sound source. I think my personal favorite aspect of this so far is exploring all of the no-input mixer style chaotic feedback patching techniques with the added ability of being able to send modulation into the levels of the bands and the amount of feedback so that you can create a kind of sequenced or automated feedback patch. But I'm also really interested in continuing to explore this module in the future to see what other kinds of patches and sounds I can come up with. A special thank you to Zlob Modular for making this module and for letting me try one out. If you are interested in downloading extended audio cuts from this video, you can head over to my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/SarahBelleReid, and sign up as a member to access those, in addition to a whole bunch of other extended cuts and tutorials from all of my YouTube videos, audio downloads, and behind-the-scenes content from my personal creative projects, and a whole lot more. Thank you all for tuning in and watching. I wish you all very happy fixed filter bank feedback spectral decoding adventures ahead. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.